Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Washington Avenue Corridor Study virtual public meeting. My name is Caroline Bailey, and I'll be starting off the presentation. First off, we would like for everyone to sign in. We put the link to sign in the chat. So if you could click on that and sign in, that way we know who attended the meeting and we have a good head count. The next, we just have a brief agenda. We're going to go through the introduction, give a brief summary of the project, talk about the alternative framework, the alternative design option, and the pedestrian realm. We have a short interactive activity, and then we'll have a Q&A session before we talk about next steps. Next slide. So I want to introduce the team first. So my name is Caroline Bailey. I'm a senior planner at HGSD, and I'm the project manager for the study. With us, we have our consultant team, Hewitt Dollars, who is in charge of the project management and the urban planning, Lion Hart, who's in charge of landscape architecture and urban design, and then T.Y. Lin, who is doing traffic engineering. Next slide. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to add any questions that you have. We are going to have time to answer these questions after the presentation and during the breakout session. And then please stay muted during the meeting so that everyone can hear the presenters. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hewitt Dollars to talk about the project.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for spending some time with us. First, we want to walk you through what we've learned around the corridor in existing conditions. So what is the Washington Avenue Corridor Study? This project, as Caroline was talking to you about, is a Houston-Galveston area council-led study, and we do have the city of Houston as partner on the study. The project was recommended back in 2012 in a Washington Avenue Livable Centers, which Hewitt Zollers was a part of. The project is focused around Washington Avenue, but it also includes Center Street and Westcott to the west side of this. The study is intended to create a plan for the future configurations of these streets, as well as 12 major intersections. Please note it is not a full street detailed project, and it is currently not funded for construction at this phase. It is a critical component, the critical component of this study. It is coming out of a high injury network. There are currently limited locations for safe pedestrian crossings as well as bike crossings along these streets today. So the goal of the study will be to encourage and recommend short-term and long-term multimodal transportation options that would increase these things. They would increase improvement of traffic flow, reduction of congestion, and could potentially lead to cleaner air. The study will conclude with a prioritized list of recommended improvements, and recommendations will offer equal emphasis on all modes of transportation based on what we hear from the community and from our steering. Next slide. So at the beginning of the project, we set some goals for the project, and the future of Washington Avenue Corridor is a thriving, sustainable, livable neighborhood because it works effectively, it's safe for everyone, it connects into a network, and it is a great place for people to live at and for businesses to thrive. As we talked about, this is our study area. So outlined in red is what we, on the western end, Washington and the Westcott, coming down to the roundabout, and then heading east is Washington Avenue, paralleled just north by Center. And then all of the white dots are the 12 major intersections that Sarah will be talking to you a little bit more in depth, but these are the intersections that we've looked at closely. And so what is today's goal? So the meeting is intended to get feedback from everyone here to choose your we'll be presenting alternatives and for you to say, this is my selected alternative. And so that's really the goal of today's meeting. And that is, as Caroline was saying, we also want to understand from you how that pedestrian realm is laid out as well. Next slide. And so what we've learned from this study so far, I'll walk you through some highlights to put this all into context. The right-of-way of Washington is limited. You can see here it's mainly composed of 2 traffic lanes in each direction with a continuous turn lane for the majority of the corridor, except north of the right-of-way where things change a little bit. But you can see at its tightest, Washington Avenue is about 60, and at its widest on the western end is 100-foot right-of-way with climbing all the way up into 160 on the western end. Crash data tells us that there are serious and dangerous hotspots around Washington Avenue. The yellower spots are the most serious injuries and crashes. And then as they go into red and blue, it's less severe in the blue. You can see here there is quite a bit of suspected serious injury and 1 death that has happened along the corridor. So again, you'll notice where these have happened are the major intersections that we are looking at. The same, next slide. The same goes for center here. While not as severe, you can still see some yellow and red spots around the corridor. And yeah, what we're trying to show where seriousness has happened. Next slide. Traffic patterns on Washington show it's used more as a local connector than as a commuter. What these diagrams on the upper right-hand corner are showing, the thicker the line, the more traffic those are carrying. You'll notice the north-south lines being a lot thicker than the east-west lines. The east-west lines is Washington Avenue. And so again, a lot of cars passing through and turning off of Washington more so than continuing the entire duration on Washington. We've got, again, we're seeing as anticipated, we're seeing peaks. In other words, higher traffic happen at the morning and in the evenings with some lunchtime increasing as well. Next slide. We've got Metro's Route 85 moving through here. It is a very important route, high frequency route. You can see it goes all the way to North Houston at Greens Point Transit Center, goes through the Northwest Transit Center and runs on Washington down into the Downtown Transit Center. So connecting a good chunk of Houston via this high frequency route. When we looked at bikes, we've got really great off-street infrastructure to the north of us. We've got some great infrastructure to the south of us. We've got the Buffalo Bayou trails connecting it all on the eastern end, and then we've got some spots of on streets on Durham and Shepherd and some on Heights. But for the most part, there is a huge gap there in the center of the study area, and so again, looking at this gap in bike infrastructure. Crossing Washington Avenue is challenging, especially at locations where there is no signalized intersection. So what you see here is everywhere you see a traffic sign is where we've got those major intersections identified, but you can see those really big gaps in between. You know, when we look at Shepherd and Yale, we've got over 3,000 feet there between intersections. And then if you look at the roundabout north, I guess west, no traffic signals there. So again, making it a lot harder for people on foot or people on bikes to cross these major streets. Next section, next slide. So we had a round 1 engagement already last year, and we've learned, so we had a community, we engaged people via public meetings. We also have gone to Super Neighborhood 22, and we presented a lot of these different cross sections that ultimately landed at the alternatives we will be presenting to you today. And here are some of the kind of things we heard. We heard a lot around people hoping that this alternative, identify safety and thinks about other modes. And there's a desire for more outdoor space and more hangout space along the corridor. So as you can see here, we collected 600 responses via in-person meetings and also through website. And all prior input was considered in the development of these alternatives that you'll see here today. And Christoph can talk to you through, I think Sarah's going next, so I'll hand it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about intersections.
Yes, I'm going to spend a little time talking about some of the common characteristics that we carry through all of the alternatives to set the stage before we get into the different options that are available for your feedback today. There are some things that are common throughout all of them, including operational and intersection improvements, being mindful of the different modes that are moving through those areas, maintaining access for emergency services, looking at opportunities for additional signalized intersections to facilitate safe crossings. There will be a consideration of parking management along the corridor, and then timing signals to provide safe and comfortable crossing opportunities for individuals of all abilities and ages. Access management is something that will be considered along the corridor to consolidate driveways and minimize conflict points, maintaining ADA accessibility, and then considering wayfinding and parking signs, and then quality infrastructure, including pavement, drainage, lighting, and utility treatments. So as Mandy mentioned, there are selected intersections that we analyzed specifically. And we began by identifying existing turning movement counts at these intersections during the morning and evening peak hours when that rush hour traffic is at its highest. And we prepared traffic engineering models to evaluate the performance today under a future baseline or no change condition, and then through each alternative. Those traffic operations were modeled to a future year of 2045, which we established together with HGAC so that we can get a long-term view of what the redesign of the Washington Avenue corridor may look like, and provide some comfort that what's being constructed will be resilient for some time into the future and provide that long view for this plan. And then, as Mandy mentioned, safety is paramount for this corridor, given the high crash condition that is currently along Washington Avenue. And so we looked at existing data that's available from reliable sources to inform our work. Specifically, we looked at the Crash Modification Factor, or CMF, clearinghouse, which is a database provided by the Federal Highway Administration based on research studies that provide information on how different design elements can increase or decrease traffic crashes, pedestrian crashes, bike crashes along a corridor. And we also looked at the Oregon Department of Transportation CMS database. The Oregon DOT has their own research fund that is funded by their Highway Safety Improvement Program. And their program has been so robust that their information supplements and is complementary to the Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse, so much so that it's actually hosted on the Federal Highway Administration's website. So those are two very reliable sources that we look to understand how different design elements for all of these alternatives may influence safety. And then finally, the third technical metric that we are looking at relates to level of comfort, or what we call level of traffic stress for cyclists. And that's a rating from 4 to 1, ranging from least comfortable to most comfortable. And it's informed by 3 factors. One is the posted speed or prevailing speed of traffic on a roadway, the volume of traffic on that roadway, and then finally the type of bicycle facility, so that we could rate the level of stress for cyclists along both Washington Avenue and along Center Street in each alternative. So as part of our evaluation of modeling the future baseline condition in that 2045 design year that I mentioned, we saw some opportunities to integrate some common best practices that we often apply in traffic engineering to maximize functionality and safety along the corridor. So the first example I'll speak to is how there are multiple intersections along our study corridor where there are large green spaces in the medians. And if we were to shift that green space from the median to the edges of the street, we could reduce the size of the intersections. All other variables held equal, a smaller intersection is going to be safer than a larger intersection. And it also unlocks a few opportunities. There's reduced crash exposure by shortening the travel distance through the intersection. That's true whether you're driving, biking, or walking. And we can also increase space where people can access it along the edges of the street, which may be used for sidewalks, landscaping, and other types of amenities without directly reducing the vehicular capacity. In this particular example, TC Jester aligns opposite a small private driveway, and it doesn't align directly across. And so at this intersection, you may have noticed TC Jester gets a green light at a different time than the private driveway on the south, which means a longer red light on Washington. If we can create alignment across the intersection, we can improve the efficiency of the signal timings and therefore reduce delay for drivers by allowing those green lights to happen at the same time. Moving on to our next intersection treatment, there are opportunities where we may be able to consolidate what we're calling excess channelization. That may relate to turn lanes that aren't necessary based on the volume of traffic and the capacity need, but then also some redundant parallel roadways where we are increasing the points of conflict, we are interrupting the pedestrian realm more often, and we are potentially enabling drivers to take those turns at a higher rate of speed. In this particular example, we've sketched up a planning level illustration of how Wofford Street and Waugh Drive might be able to be consolidated in a way that is more directly aligned opposite Yale. And we would reduce crash exposure by reducing points of conflict and also the travel distance through the intersection. At Heights, we see an opportunity to add an additional left turn lane, which is something that we typically look at when we have very heavy left turn volumes. Maybe some of you have sat in long queues waiting to turn left from Heights onto Washington, something we observe in our existing condition, and we expect that would be exacerbated as traffic grows into the future. So by adding this additional capacity, we can reduce the impact of those left turn lanes on the rest of the intersection, since they would be expected to queue all the way back and block those through lanes. And then we can better balance how the green time is spread around at this intersection and create better functionality overall. Also, using Heights as an example, there are several locations where we see that what we call an extra receiving lane in the traffic engineering world. You can see in the photo at the left, at the top of the picture, you see two red arrows representing two through lanes that are passing through the intersection. But when you get to the south side of Heights, on the south side of Washington, there are three red arrows representing three lanes that those two driver lanes can go through. So this does not increase the capacity for drivers, since it's after you've already passed through the intersection, but it does increase the size of the intersection, increases the crossing distance for pedestrians, so we can achieve better safety for people traveling via all modes if we can consolidate that space. And in this particular case, you see it could potentially free up more space to add those dual lefts, putting that pavement space where the vehicular demand really needs it. Then in terms of signals, there's a few ways we can make some tweaks to the signalized intersections along the corridor. For those that are already existing, we may look at the opportunity to add new left turn arrows where they're needed, or at TC Jester, perhaps change the phasing, switching them from a turn on arrow only, if we can reduce the size of the intersection and make it safer to allow them to also turn on just a standard green light. That's something that we're looking at to improve delay for drivers. And then at Patterson, we would expect that this intersection would warrant a signal. I've seen in some of the chat people have mentioned a potential bike lane improvement along Patterson that has been planned in the past. This would create a better crossing opportunity for drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians at this location by giving you the security of a green light or a pedestrian walk face. And then in terms of potential outcomes, it's worth saying that each of these treatments work in tandem, they overlap with each other, but to highlight some of the outcomes that we might see by integrating these, and these are results that are coming out of our initial traffic modeling already, where we add a new left turn arrow at Washington and Sawyer, say, we can see the left turn delay go down by up to 25%. So you would wait about 25% less time to make that left turn onto Sawyer. And then at TC Jester, with the reduced intersection size and the other treatments that I mentioned, we could reduce the vehicular delay up to 19% and also improve what we call the volume to capacity ratio, which measures how much traffic is trying to use the street relative to how much capacity it can offer. In short, it means improving the overall operations for drivers. And then from a safety standpoint, if we can reduce pedestrian crossing distance, the CMS clearinghouse tells us that we could see reductions of 30% in crashes related to pedestrian vehicle interactions. I do want to note that if we shift from a left turn arrow only to left turn when there's an arrow and also turning when there's just a green ball, there can be an increase in crashes. And so we want to do that very mindfully and think about how we are reducing the intersection footprint and make sure that's done safely. But then in installing the dual left turn lanes, that has a 47% reduction in crashes on average based on research. So these are all the things that we're thinking about as we're moving through all of the alternatives. And if you have any specific questions, please add them to the Q&A. We'll answer them as we proceed through the rest of this presentation and at the conclusion of our session today. I'll hand it off to Christoph.
Thank you. So we want to walk you through the alternatives we have for what Washington Avenue could look like. And then we are going to give you a chance to weigh in on which you think are the best alternatives. And as you will see, there is a wide range of options we are showing you. All of these came out of public input in the first round. All of these are things that people who attended our public meeting said they were interested in and said they wanted to see considered on this corridor. All of them have very different implications because of that limited right-of-way that Mandy was talking about. There's only so much we can fit. So everything we add pretty much means there's something else there isn't as much room for. Obviously, all of these include all of the modes of transportation we're considering here, but they give them different amounts of space. We'll go more into detail on crossings, medians, openings, driveways, parking, and so forth in the next phase. So really what we're talking about here today is how that space is typically allocated. So alternative A. This, like all the alternatives, would involve repaving the entire street. It would involve creating accessible sidewalks. It involves continuing to run frequent transit on the street. What we do in this alternative is we make 2 traffic lanes in each direction, which are 12 feet wide along the full length of Washington. There are some stretches where the lanes are narrower today. So this would widen the lanes in some stretches. It would keep them the same in some stretches. There's a couple short stretches. The lanes are a little bit wider than this, but 12-foot traffic lanes along the entire length of the street. And for bikes, we are doing painted sharrows on Center Street to allow to encourage bicyclists to ride on Center. So here you can see what that looks like: 2 traffic lanes in each direction, center turn lanes, and those sharrows on Center Street. If you look at what this means in terms of pedestrian space, you'll see that this goes down as low as about 6 feet in terms of the pedestrian space on both sides of the street. Here's a little feeling of what that might feel like at the intersection of Heights and Washington. Alternative B, same lane counts as alternative A, but narrower lanes. Those narrower lanes then give us a little more room in the pedestrian realm. So we've got a little more space for sidewalks and street trees in this one than we do in alternative A. These lanes are pretty similar to the current condition, but narrower than a little bit narrower than the lanes are on many stretches of Washington. And what we also do in this one is we create a bikeway along Center Street. So here you can see what that looks like. Instead of 12-foot travel lanes, we have an 11 and a 10. We still have that median turn lane. We get a little more space back of curb. And then on Center Street, we have one lane in each direction and a bikeway. Here's a little feeling of what that feels like with a little more space in that sidewalk compared to alternative A. Alternative C. Now we're starting to think of different ways to use the lanes on Washington. And what we are doing here is the outside lane becomes a bus-only lane. That bus-only lane is still used by other vehicles at intersections to make right turns. And obviously, vehicles pulling in and out of driveways are pulling in and out of that lane. But in terms of through traffic, it is reserved for buses. Other than that, the geometry looks very similar to alternative B. You can still see those center turn lanes, but the lanes allocated in different ways with a traffic lane and a bus lane in each direction. Center Street with a two-way bikeway and one lane in each direction. Here's a little feeling of what that feels like, very much like alternative B, except for the bus in the curb lane right there. Alternative D. Now we are allocating space differently here. Instead of having two traffic lanes in each direction, this does one traffic lane in each direction with right turn lanes at intersections. What this allows us to do is widen out the sidewalks in between intersections. So sidewalk width is up to about 28 feet. That allows for a lot of green space and a much more generous pedestrian space. At the intersections, the sidewalk narrows in order to allow those turn lanes, which means at the intersections, the sidewalk looks more like alternatives B and C. Existing conditions, future, this being taken near an intersection looks very similar to what we saw before, but mid-block, you'd see more space there. Alternative E, instead of taking that space for wider sidewalks, we take that space in order to create more space for bike lanes. So rather than having bikes on Center Street, we have bikes on Washington themselves. Here you can see what that looks like. Bike lanes on both sides of the street with one traffic lane in each direction and a center turn lane. In some instances, space permitting, we may also add right turn lanes to this, but there is not space for that the whole way along. That means that this alternative has more traffic congestion than alternative D does because of that lack of right turn lanes at some of those intersections. Here's alternative E. You can see what we're proposing here is the bike lanes at sidewalk levels alongside the sidewalk. So the bikes would not be in the sidewalk, but they would be behind the curb to separate them from cars with the ability to do landscaping around that lane. Alternative F. This alternative changes along the length of Washington. From Heights Boulevard to the west, this alternative has two lanes in each direction and looks very much like alternative B in terms of lane dimensions and everything else. But between Heights Boulevard and downtown, this alternative drops in center running light rail. One traffic lane in each direction, one track in each direction, and light rail stations in the median. It also provides that bikeway on Center Street. The reason for considering this is that the lowest level of traffic along this corridor is actually close to downtown, and the widest right-of-way is close to downtown, which means we can keep two traffic lanes in the places where traffic is highest And it also means we do not need any property acquisition to be able to fit light rail in between Heights and downtown. This light rail could be a continuation of the green and purple lines, which already extend through downtown and end at the theater district. They could thus continue out to Heights Boulevard. Alternatively, instead of center running light rail, this could also be bus rapid transit. Here's what that looks like. You will see the light rail tracks in the center. You will see that center station platform. And in this case, since we're looking at Heights Boulevard, you're actually seeing the place where the tracks end. We would thus continue bus service on the street, but that bus might take an alternate route from Heights Boulevard on into downtown with a transfer point at this location. Alternative F, giving you a feeling of what that feels like with the light rail in the center of the street. And finally, alternative G. In this case, we are adding light rail to the street along its entire length. This could be a continuation of green and purple lines in downtown. And on the west end, it would likely continue on to Northwest Transit Center. What this means, though, is that we have one traffic lane in both directions along the full length of the corridor. Also, because the corridor gets significantly narrower on the west end, this would require some property acquisition in order to fit stations and at some intersections. So this is the only alternative we are showing that does not fit within the current right-of-way. Here's a little bit look at what that looks like. It is similar in that you have light rail in the center with station platforms. Wherever we have an intersection, we need a turn lane to allow for left turns at a signalized intersection. You will only be able to cross the tracks at those signalized intersections. Existing conditions and a little feel of what that would feel like in the street. So these are 7 very different design options. We'll give you a chance to ask us questions, which you already are doing, and answer your questions in just a little bit. But we also wanted to think about what the implications are of these before we do this. Because if you look at the back of curb space, everything between the curb and the property line, which is where the sidewalk fits, which is where landscaping fits, which is on-street dining and other uses of that space, there is a great deal of variation here. We're as narrow as 6 feet, and we're as wide as 28.5 feet. And there's a lot of things that could be done with that space. So I want to turn it over to Lionheart to talk about that pedestrian realm.
Okay, great. One of the things, well, Christoph mentioned how much needs to go on behind the curb. A few of those things are entrances into buildings and to adjacent patios and plaza spaces, the sidewalks to connect people from parking to the buildings, and planted areas. We find that people walk quite a bit more when they have some shade in which to do that. And also street furnishings, including waste bins, but also benches for people to rest along their path. And in some cases where you have the luxury of additional space, we like to allow some of the activity inside buildings to flow out into the pedestrian realm in the form of outdoor cafe space or outdoor displays. And so there's a lot that can go on behind the curb, and certainly in an active commercial corridor like Washington Avenue, there will be some demand for some of these things as we move forward. Next slide. Yeah, this slide. So these are a few of the things that we plan to achieve with the pedestrian realm. What we hear from you today will tell us how well we can achieve some of these things. Safe distance from vehicles is really important. Making sure that as you're a pedestrian and you're unprotected, that you still feel safe. And sometimes the way to get that is from distance. Facilitating stopping and transitioning from one mode to the next. That could be around a bus stop. It could be around bike racks. And Ubers pull up, people get out and try to access the businesses. So making space for that in the pedestrian realm. supporting the local businesses and making sure that they have what they need to thrive and have that clear access to their buildings. ADA compliance is essential on a streetscape in today's world, and there are many places out there today that don't really meet current ADA requirements. So it really needs to be a streetscape that's convenient and inclusive for all users, various modes, but also meeting and achieving the ADA standards, and improving connectivity around the intersections, making it clear how every mode navigates around an intersection is important. In addition, we like to think about, the back of the curb as an opportunity to be pedestrian friendly, and this is where people live, as they get out of their car and they're going to their homes or their businesses. This is where the vibrancy of the street really happens, and planting zones for that, but also, social interaction and public health space as well. Next slide. So we've put together a few images of various streetscapes. Some are in Houston, some are in other US cities for the most part, just to show you that there's not one approach for this. There's no one way that every street should always be designed. It really is context sensitive. And so you can see in some of these pictures up against the building, sometimes you see what we like to call a transition zone. Sometimes it's planting around the foundation, like on Bagby Street there. Sometimes it's space for outdoor dining or outdoor displays, like the Bishop Arts District in Dallas, for example. Next, you'd see the sidewalk zone. This is the clear zone where people walk. And that really needs to be at least, 6 feet wide, and so that people can pass. And it also needs to be consistent. It can't be jumping around in the streetscape too much for people to actually be able to navigate that well. Then we have what we would call the furnishing zone. Sometimes that gets doubled up and layered in with the tree zone, so that if you do have waste bins, you do have benches, that they have a place to live on the streetscape as well. Bike racks, for example. And then finally, you have the moving vehicles. You have the parked or moving vehicles, and those can be bicycles, transit, or single occupancy vehicles. Anything that's moving quicker than pedestrians lives in that space. So that's just to give you an idea of some of the possibilities around the back of curb improvements. And in a minute, we're going to ask you to do a little exercise with us, because we want to hear more from you about what happens behind the curb. We have heard that it's important to you what happens behind the curb, but now we want to drill into what does that mean behind the curb. And so next slide. Excuse me. So those zones that I had just mentioned, from building out to the moving traffic, we're actually going to play a little game with y'all as we break out into breakout rooms here in a minute. And we're going to let you all design streetscapes based on those zones. So, using the curb on one side and the building on the other side as kind of the boundaries of this. So that will take place in just a minute. And we like to explore with you what happens if you have a luxurious amount of space. Like I think Christoph said one of our alternatives has 28 to 30 feet behind the curb. Or what if you're very, very constrained on space? Another alternative is lucky to get 6 feet in some places. So how do we take what you might say is an ideal back of curb condition and prioritize the things that are most important to you, so that we can kind of, as we think about it more context sensitive and in real space, how we can make decisions about what lives behind the curb. All right, so I believe we're breaking out into breakout rooms now, right, Madeline?
Yes, I'll be opening the rooms right away. Lots of folks who entered in here. Go to the next slide, Christoph. So there should have been a pop-up for everyone. Let's start heading out into your rooms for the activity. Is anyone not seeing the pop-up?
I have not yet, Madeline.
Okay, you should be there, but I can try to force you out. It might have gotten like, yeah, I'm just gonna move you. Oh no, it won't let me. Can you like click somewhere else on your screen?
There we go.
Okay. Hi, is anyone here having troubles accessing their breakout room?
Hey, everyone. Just giving people some time to come back into the main room.
Okay, it looks like everyone's back.
Okay. So what we want to do now is start answering the questions that all of you put in the chat. So I've got some notes here. We'll go through these and call on other team members as we go. So first question we got was, what happens after voting for the options? Since the project is not funded, how would the solutions be implemented? So I think overall, this particular study is designed to come to a recommendation. And at that point, an implementing entity like the city could choose to move forward with that recommendation and find funding for the project. But we are not making the decision of whether the project is funded or whether the project is moving forward. So Caroline, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you summed it up pretty well, but once the study is complete, we'll give it to the city of Houston, and they can decide if they want to move forward or not.
Now, one of the purposes of studies like these is it does define a project, which can make it easier to go after funding for that project. But there's nothing in this study which immediately results in a project.
Christoph, can I
Yeah.
add just one thing to that? The plan will come out with some short-term recommendations. And so while this is a long-range plan, there could be some opportunity for investment in some parts of the corridor for improvement. So
Yeah. You just answered the next question we got, which is
yes.
what is the overall timeline and are there components that could be implemented quicker or in the short term? Transit. What could be done to speed up the 85 bus and keep it on time? Could a limited stop service be provided? Could the Metro Rail green or purple line be extended to the corridor? Currently, the 85 bus gets stuck in traffic behind traffic lights. I think I'll give an answer here and see if anybody else wants to chime in. There are a lot of things you can do to make a bus more reliable. Some of them are relatively straightforward, like improving stops. If stops have a better concrete pad, it means that the time the bus takes to stop and load passengers can be quicker, especially if passengers are in a wheelchair. Beyond that, reducing the number of stops can make a bus faster and more reliable. So a limited stop service, for example, could do some good, or just consolidating some of the current stops. And then traffic signal priority can make a meaningful difference, but ultimately nothing else does quite as much in areas where you have traffic congestion as doing bus lanes, which is why we are showing those in one of the alternatives, because that would lead to more reliable transit service, even though all of the alternatives include some things that could make buses more reliable. Obviously, the Metro Rail Green Purple Line extension is something we are showing as one of the alternatives. So if you like that, you can tell us. And I think that answers that question, unless another team member wants to chime in on that. We also got a question on, can you explain how the reliability differs for the transit service between the curb running and center running options? And is curb running bus just as reliable as center running transit? There is a difference in reliability there, because a curb running bus could end up behind cars making right turns at an intersection, and it could also end up being held up by cars pulling out of a driveway. So those curb running lanes are more reliable and faster than a bus in general traffic, but they are not quite as fast and reliable as the center running lanes. Won't the I-10 rebuild include bus lanes and bike lanes? The I-10 rebuild does include, through both TxDOT and Metro proposals, an HOV lane or a bus lane that would connect downtown to Northwest Transit Center. That could then be used by things like the 160 series buses, which are express buses that end up going out the Katy Freeway to Memorial City, and by the park and rides. However, if you look at the map, the Katy Freeway alignment is up to half a mile away from the Washington Avenue corridor. And those alternatives would include either no stations or a limited number of stations. So ultimately, a bus running down the Katy Freeway is serving a different set of riders than a bus going down Washington Avenue. I do not believe the I-10 rebuild includes any bike lanes. I assume that for alternatives A and B, the buses share 2 car lanes in each direction. Is this correct? Yes, that is correct. Any of the alternatives in which we are not showing bus or light rail lanes would have buses running in the curb lane of the general traffic lane. Would the rail line look like Fulton does now? I think Fulton is a good comparison in terms of general configuration to what this would look like. Obviously, there's a lot of really critical design details in something like this, but I think that's generally what we're looking like. Some of the fastest growing census tracts in the city are along Washington, some growing 20% in population over 5 years. If this growth continues, will the current auto-dominant capacity of Washington become maxed out? And could a reliable transit option allow for greater capacity? I think is a really good question. And what the traffic analysis has shown is that as traffic continues to grow, current levels of traffic congestion go up. Ultimately, transit can be an alternative to that. And transit also has the capacity to carry more people in the same space than a general traffic lane. Obviously, that is useful only if people are riding it. But if the ridership is there, it does add a lot of capacity to the corridor. Sarah, do you want to add anything on the traffic question?
I'll just affirm what you said, Christoph, that with the projected growth in the HGAC regional model, we expect that some of the intersections that may function what we would call acceptable in traffic engineering today would exceed capacity. And so some solutions will need to be reached, which is why we looked at those blanket intersection treatments as well to improve functionality and efficiency, as well as safety.
Can you explain, another question, can you explain how light rail ending at Heights would work? Would there be a turnaround, stop and change direction? Yes, if you look at the end of any of the current light rail lines, the way it works is the train pulls into the last station. The operator then gets out of the cab they were driving the train from, walks to the other end of the train, and then the train pulls out of the station in what you might say is backwards, but in reality, a light rail train can go forward in both directions. So there's no kind of loop, nothing elaborate needed at the end of the line for that to work. We got quite a few questions about bikes. You mentioned you looked at cyclist comfort for Washington and Center. What did the study show? And we had a wide range between the different alternatives. For alternative A, there is no protected bike infrastructure. And so generally we consider that a fairly low level of comfort because bikes are mixing with cars. But we would have some spots with additional bike infrastructure at the far east and the far west end. For all of the alternatives that have a center street bikeway, Washington would remain a not particularly comfortable or safe place to bike. But we would end up with protected bike lanes separated from cars parallel to Washington along Center for the majority of the length of the study segment. And what we're showing is a continuation of those so that they form a full network on both ends. That would make for a much higher comfort facility than we have today in terms of east-west biking. And alternative E, we provide bike lanes on Washington that are designed so those are high comfort, quite safe bike lanes that we think a lot of people would feel comfortable biking in. Somebody asked, why isn't there an option that includes bike lanes on both Washington and Center? If you think that is a good option, please tell us that in the survey because we would very much like to hear that. I think it's definitely possible to do that. What about pedestrian bike bridges like in other countries with very good public transportation? Doing a pedestrian or bike bridge takes a lot of space because you need to be able to ramp at both ends of those. Those ramps can be effectively the length of a city block. In most cases, we don't actually have a lot of room in the right-of-way to do that. In addition to that, any bridge like that is essentially forcing pedestrians and bicyclists to go up and back down, which can definitely be inconvenient and take a lot of extra energy to do that. So it's very hard to fit situations like that into a street like this. Whether the bike lane is on Center or Washington, the issue is still getting to the bike lane from north and south. How is access to the bike lane addressed? I think in moving forward into the next phase, we would be looking at opportunities for north-south connections, which would help bring people to that bike lane. And as mentioned before, looking at additional safe crossings of Washington, which also help with that. I'm curious what would drive putting bike lanes on Washington, where Center seems to be safer than Washington. We got a lot of public input in the first round where people said, we want you to consider bikes on Washington. Obviously, if you're on the south side of Washington, Washington's closer to you than Center is. And there's also destinations directly on Washington. There's more destinations directly on Washington than there are directly on Center. So Washington bike lanes have the advantage of going directly to those. But there is a reason we showed that in an alternative and not in other alternatives, because fundamentally we want your input. Going on to travel lanes, what is the minimum width that Whitmire said traffic lanes should be? I can't speak for the mayor. I've seen a lot of recent city policy around 12-foot lanes, and we do have an alternative that shows that. But also, this is a long-term vision, and the direction of this project is to really show the public the alternatives and get input on them. I don't know if, Caroline, you want to add anything to that?
Just, we want to explore all alternatives, and as you said, the long-term plan, though, 10 years from now, circumstances may be different.
Okay, what is the average daily traffic per direction for Washington? The Federal Highway Administration recommends if this number does not exceed 750, reducing car lanes from 2 each way to 1 each way will double this metric and will result in a plan that is out of compliance with recommended federal guidelines. Worse than that, traffic will become a gridlock. Putting bikes on major thoroughfare is not safe for either pedestrians or cars. Sarah, you want to speak to that?
Yes, I can speak to that. So I'll mention first the Federal Highway Administration metric that's mentioned there is from a resource called the Road Diet Informational Guide, which provides some rules of thumb for how jurisdictional agencies might consider different streets where a lane reduction is probably feasible, a range of hourly traffic where it may be feasible and should be subject to further modeling, and then a threshold at which traffic above that amount is likely not going to be feasible without some shifting of traffic away from that corridor in one form or another. So that 750 number is representative of that probably feasible. There's a range that's 750 to 875 from that manual from 2014 that is that probably that is that may be feasible but requires further analysis. And so that's why we're developing specific capacity analysis models for the Washington Avenue corridor, both as a future baseline in year 2045 and for each alternative that's being analyzed here. So if we look at those year 2045 traffic volumes, there are portions of Washington where the peak hour approach volume is in the neighborhood of 700. There are some portions of Washington where the peak hour approach volume is closer to 1100. And so those are things that we analyzed for each alternative. It's not what informs the development of the alternatives. We wanted to provide a variety of options that was reflective of the feedback heard in the first public engagement meeting, so that the community who's participating in this meeting, going to the website and providing their feedback otherwise, is able to give a response on how we prioritize the use of this space, because urban corridors are inherently a fixed amount of space, and so we need to consider trade-offs and what our priorities are when we're selecting how to allocate that space within the right way. If the feedback were to lean toward alternatives that led to a reduction in number of lanes, it's true that some of that traffic would need to shift in one of three ways: either shift to another route, shift to another mode, or shift to another corridor. And so those are things that are being presented as we are working through this project, both in the public realm with you all and in our discussions with the steering committee meeting of the governmental agencies that are weighing in on this project. Great question. Thank you.
And one more question for you, Sarah. For long-term modeling, what % population growth per year was built into that?
Yeah, also a very good question. So the growth that we applied to the existing traffic is informed by the regional model that's maintained by HGAC. And typically those models have inputs of population growth and employment growth in the whole region is divided into zones. And so that population and employment growth is assigned to each of the zones. And then the model contemplates how people may travel between those zones based on those growth patterns. And it translates it into a daily volume of traffic on major corridors. So rather than a uniform growth rate, we looked at how the regional model anticipates people will travel along Washington Avenue, and it's not uniform along Washington Avenue. As Mandy shared earlier, we have some unique travel patterns along Washington and along the north-south streets that are intersecting it. The growth rates that we applied based on what the regional model anticipates, factoring in population and employment growth in the greater region, it ranges from as low as 0.63 per year, which up to 2045 is about 14% total growth, to 1.93% per year, which is a little more than 42% total growth. So that's what has gone into our future traffic analysis models.
I will nod to two other questions real quick, and then we are going to move on. One was a question about parking, that currently parking is allowed off-peak in the curb lanes on Washington. Obviously, that could be continued if we do alternatives A or B. In the other alternatives, we would not allow parking on Washington Avenue. What we will look at is other parking strategies, which could include building additional parking near the street to serve those needs. And a question on how these projects would improve or not crossing Washington Avenue. This is something we are going to look at more detail in the next round, and we will talk about more in the next public meeting. We are definitely looking at more safe crossing locations on Washington. And with that, we want to get to the heart of the issue, which is that there are 7 different design options, and we want to hear what you think in that whole spectrum of options. And that we have an online survey for. So basically we are, I believe, dropping the link to the survey in the chat. We want you to go there. We want you to tell us what the best option is. And there's also chances there to give comments and even do things like suggest other alternatives, if some people have so far. So basically, if you look at this, right now we are just in a project study. That can lead to a project development if somebody like the city chooses to move forward with it, which can ultimately lead to engineering and construction. So whatever happens out of this, we are talking at fastest a couple years away before anything happens here. And if you have additional questions, you can contact Caroline. Here is her contact information. And with that, Caroline, you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you all for coming and attending the meeting tonight. We really appreciate your participation, your feedback. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. You can call me too, but email preferred. And then please take our survey, which is in the chat. It will be open until March 23rd. And with that, have a wonderful evening. Thank you again.